In this video, we're going to talk about Johnson & Johnson supply chain. There will be four major questions that we will be discussing. The first one being the role the supply chain management plays in the organization, how the supply chain is structured for Johnson & Johnson, what strategies and techniques are used for supply chain management activities, and finally, how does supply chain management contribute to the success of Johnson & Johnson. First, we will discuss the company history of Johnson & Johnson. In 1886, Johnson & Johnson was founded in New Brunswick, New Jersey. About 40 years later, Johnson & Johnson opened its first operating company in the UK. In 1932, Johnson & Johnson is transformed into a global decentralized family of companies. Only 5 years later, the company expands operation to Argentina and Brazil. In addition, the company establishes Ortho Research Laboratories in Linden, New Jersey to develop health products for women. In 1944, Johnson & Johnson goes public with a listing on the New York Stock Exchange. Furthermore, in 1957, Johnson & Johnson opens their first operating company in India. In 1959, Johnson & Johnson acquires McNeil Laboratories in the US, which was huge for them because it takes over the production of Tylenol. Also, they took over Schleicher Chemie NAG in Europe, which gave the company a significant presence in the pharmaceutical industry. From 1976 to 1989, Johnson & Johnson enters new areas of health, which include vision care, mechanical wound closures, and diabetes management. The company also opens its first operating companies in China and Egypt. From 1989 to 2002, Neutrogena Corporation, Codex Clinical Diagnostics Business, Cordis Corporation, and Senocor joined the family of companies initiated by Johnson & Johnson. The company continues to expand into Russia and Eastern Europe. In 2002, Johnson & Johnson acquires Tibec Verco BBVA to help address the vast unmet needs of patients with HIV and AIDS and other infectious diseases such as tuberculosis. Only 10 years ago in 2006, Johnson & Johnson acquires Pfizer Consumer Healthcare, which brings in heritage consumer brands such as Listerine, Antiseptic, Bengay, Benadryl, amongst other well-known brands. Today, Johnson & Johnson has over 275 operating companies, in excess of 128,000 employees. It is present in 60 countries, has 125 manufacturing sites, has 400 plus distribution centers, and 600 external manufacturers. All this will tie back into our supply chain analysis that we will get into in the next slides. Here, we will discuss the role of supply chain in the organization. Supply chain of Johnson & Johnson is very big and complex, but we will dig deep into each area. The role of supply chain management at Johnson & Johnson is to move the billion-dollar corporation from an already creative company that offers a diverse product line ranging from baby care to prescription drugs and medical devices, to one that can continue to be innovative while being transparent and sustainable. With over 78,000 suppliers and just under an estimated $31 billion in spending, Johnson & Johnson's influence is far-reaching, and so is the role of its supply operations. Johnson & Johnson uses its global supply chain network to connect with hospitals, pharmacies, retailers, distributors, and wholesalers in order to reach people around the world. In 1943, Robert Wood Johnson, a member of Johnson & Johnson's founding family, crafted a credo that outlined the company's role and responsibility to do everything with the highest quality. Therefore, its end-to-end supply chain begins with the customer and exits to serve the customer. According to the Johnson & Johnson Global Supply Management Institute, Johnson & Johnson's global goal is to achieve a competitive strategy by building a reliable supply chain at the lowest possible cost that would support innovation and growth. However, the company has experienced multiple product recalls dating back to 2009 involving a significant amount of the company's over-the-counter medicine, which was uncovered which was uncovered that these recalls were due to systematic processes and other issues that reflect directly with the company's supply chain. In light of the product recalls in recent years, the company has begun to centralize its supply chain efforts, focusing on implementing the best practices in sourcing, logistics, and transportation. If you see in the top left-hand square, you can see that their number one priority is to ensure that their products are high quality and available when needed. The next square over says when quality, R&D, and commercial and supply chain closely collaborate, Johnson & Johnson can enable the design, production, and delivery of products that add value and help drive a competitive advantage. The supply chain's role is to focus on innovation, sustainability, flexibility, positive customer service. And they must plan and manufacture the right product in the right quantities at the right place at the right time. At the end, their end-to-end supply chain exists to serve the customer, and we will get a little bit more into detail on how they do this. Johnson & Johnson focuses on promoting sustainability throughout their supply chain. This leads to improved performance as well as influence the performance of their supply chain partners. Johnson & Johnson gives preference to purchasing products or services that demonstrate 1. Use of renewable resources, 2. The use of sustainable practices, 3. Energy efficiency, 4. Packaging efficiency, 5. Transportation efficiency, and 6. Recyclables. Johnson & Johnson has changed its strategy and applied a new lean approach. New initiative is built upon a transactional approach in which cost reduction is achieved beyond just manufacturing processes and emphasizes inventory management, credit returns, distribution centers, e-business mistake proofing, contract management, pricing issues, and how to improve the entire customer management. Johnson & Johnson had faced a couple of sustainability challenges and therefore created some sustainability initiatives. Prior to 2012, Johnson & Johnson had a difficult time assuring customers that partners and assets involved in the supply chain process were utilizing best practices. In 2013, Johnson & Johnson was able to confirm that it decreased its energy usage from 13.3 trillion British thermal units in 2010 to 12.9 trillion British thermal units in 2012. Such information was released in the Enterprise's 2013 Citizenship and Sustainability Report. The enterprise was able to achieve such an accomplishment by initiating Project Cold, an endeavor that sought to reduce power consumption throughout its transportation and cold storage processes. The sustainability initiative included the organization monitoring the greenhouse gas outputs of its third-party logistic providers. The company surveys emissions of nitrous oxides, sulfur oxides, and volatile organic compounds. The organization considers it imperative to find and partner with trucking enterprises committed to promoting a sound sustainability strategy for its shippers and trying to maintain positive reputation. In this segment, we'll look at the structure of Johnson & Johnson supply chain management. First and foremost, we need to understand that Johnson & Johnson has a push-pull strategy. As far as the push aspect, it pushes the product through research and development, marketing efforts, and by creating a need for the product. As far as the pull strategy, the organization employs a number of entities in the supply chain process to ensure that it produces just enough product for its consumers. The company is mindful not to overproduce because many of their products have expiration dates. Also, by overproducing, they can incur costs such as depreciation, warehousing, and tie-up capital. If the company underproduces, it might lose out on potential customers and business. If demands exceed capacity or forecasted production, consumers might seek substitutes elsewhere. In order to reduce overproduction, Johnson & Johnson relies on various companies in between itself and the consumer. Distributors and retailers put feelers such as ads and utilize sales analytics to constantly gauge the demand for products, so it would know how much to request in the next order. Johnson & Johnson's supply chain is large and complex, as we mentioned before, but to facilitate this effort, their environment, health, safety, and sustainability, and their procurement teams work together very closely, integrating their processes and approach. and elevating their internal awareness of the importance of managing their supply chain risks. The risks include operational and regulatory risks, which include any changes in laws wherever they're operating. The reputational risk, meaning all of their social responsibility aspects of the company. They also have healthcare compliant risk, which they have to make sure that they're complying within the healthcare, all the pharmaceutical products that they distribute. Johnson & Johnson prides itself on taking responsibility for the environment and the social impacts of their products. This sense of responsibility is carried throughout the product cycle from design and development to sourcing, manufacturing, and transportation. As we mentioned in previous slides, Johnson & Johnson is constantly focusing on promoting sustainability throughout their supply chain. The company's procurement sustainability initiative aligns their procurement processes with their sustainability efforts and provides guidance for Johnson & Johnson operating company managers who purchase goods and services. The company encourages their suppliers to measure their energy use and greenhouse gas emissions and to develop and publicly report on their emissions. Ongoing assessments of new or existing suppliers are mostly prioritized based on the supplier category. External manufacturing sites and the active pharmaceutical ingredient supplier sites are high on the priority list and receive the most detailed assessments. Assessments may be conducted on the remaining 12 supplier categories for certain factors, with emphasis on all of their segment 1 suppliers and certain R&D and chemical suppliers. Furthermore, we will be looking at strategies and techniques used for supply chain management at Johnson & Johnson. First, we have to point out the fact that Johnson & Johnson practices lean manufacturing. It reduces supply chain costs by eliminating supply chain waste in everything from transportation, inventory, motion, overproduction, overprocessing, and defects. Also, they are innovative and quick to the market with new products, which gives them a competitive advantage. They are able to get competitive prices due to their leverage. We already mentioned about their purchasing power, the fact that they purchase over $31 billion annually in supplies. Also, they have the environment, health and safety, and sustainability and procurement teams that we mentioned also that work very closely in order to get the best results. Johnson & Johnson participates in the Carbon Disclosure Project supply chain program, which helps a company gain a competitive advantage as well in the market by working with its suppliers to reduce energy use and greenhouse gas emissions, also mentioned previously in a couple slides, but it still needs to be mentioned as a strategy and as a technique of their supply chain. Johnson & Johnson's procurement sustainability initiatives provides a foundation to guide its procurement professionals in their purchasing decisions. Also, another advantage that has been mentioned before, but it is a technique and a strategy that they use in their supply chain. Johnson & Johnson is a huge supporter of diverse and small businesses. In 2014, they spent a total of $1.5 billion in supporting diverse and small businesses. They cultivate a healthy and growing small and diverse supplier base. Minorities, women, and the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender community, LGBT, and veteran owners are all vital partners to Johnson & Johnson's success. This image better depicts what we just stated. They have the largest and most diversified healthcare company in the world. 31 consecutive years of adjusted earnings increase. They are rated AAA. They have 52 consecutive years of dividend increases. They have about 70% of sales from number 1 or number 2 global market share position, about 25% of sales from products launched in the past 5 years, and about 70% of 10-year free cash flow return to shareholders. So it shows the sustainability and as well as the social responsibility of the company, not just in one area of the world, but globally. Lastly, we'll look at how Johnson & Johnson supply chain management contributes to their success. Johnson & Johnson has a huge demonstration of demand-driven leadership, inward-focused supply management functions to supply chains that orchestrate a profitable response to demand. As we saw in its history, it was a very huge decentralized company, but since then has worked towards being centralized. The demand-driven value network model is characterized by an understanding of customer value and enabled by processes and metrics that enable businesses trade-offs to deliver products and services profitability. Companies that work toward the DDVN ideal use demand management as a key differentiating capability so they can plan, sense, and shape in a way that brings a profitable balance to the business. They also design supply networks to be more closely aligned with the development of product platforms that enable innovation, agility, and responsiveness. We find that companies that have successfully shifted from the traditional disconnected approach to managing supply, demand, and product to an integrated approach to coordinating plan, source, make, and deliver functions across the end-to-end supply chain. Companies typically make this shift as they advance along the DDVN maturity journey, which represents a long-term commitment to doing business in a customer value-centric way. Johnson & Johnson supply chain has a legacy of decentralized decision-making, as previously mentioned, but has become more center-led over the years as a center of excellence formed to drive cross-business unit improvements. One of these programs is focused on complexity management and data-driven governance of the company's diverse product portfolios. The COE team is also working to better understand the voice of the customer and the pharmaceutical business following a method of immersion, innovation, and connection. The team starts with patients and their unmet needs, then walks back through the supply chain process by which they get their drugs through intermediaries to identify potential improvements. For one product line, the packaging and instructions were simplified to improve patient adherence to their prescriptions. The COE is also delivering enhanced track and trace capabilities in support of global brand protection. So with that, we conclude our analysis of Johnson & Johnson supply chain management. Here is our team: Nadine Demaliwat, Barbara Garcia Powell, Corina Etheridge, Marel Johnson, no relations to Johnson & Johnson, and myself, Fernando Garcia. Thank you so much for your attention, and here is a list of our references that we use throughout our presentation.